Hi, my name is Amin Bashiri, and in this work, we're gonna study onion messages, which are a newly introduced feature to the Lightning Network that facilitate duplex communication between nodes inside the network before payment execution. So in order to do that, we first go through a brief overview of the Lightning Network. Lightning Network is a payment channel network built on top of Bitcoin as a layer 2. Its main goal is to provide a scalability because Bitcoin blockchain itself lacks a scalability. Another thing that the Lightning Network attempts to provide for the users is privacy and anonymity. It does so by using onion encrypted messaging and hiding channel balances from the public. How Lightning Network currently works, the payment procedure, is that the payee generates an invoice and communicates that invoice to the payer through a off-network way of communication, like scanning QR codes or NFC. And then the payer gets that invoice. The invoice contains enough information for the payer to be able to execute the payment. So the payer creates the unencrypted messages, chooses some nodes like B and C to be in the path, and sends the payment through those nodes to the pay. But there is a problem with this current method because, as you can see, the communication before payment execution is one way only from pay to the payer, and the payer doesn't have any method of communicating information to the payer to the payee before payment execution. And the lack of duplex communication before payment execution doesn't allow us to have some features like static invoices or subscriptions or refunds on the Lightning Network. For example, for refunds, if the payer wants to get a refund, it has to generate a new invoice, communicate that again on an off-network way of communication like QR codes to the payee to get the refund, which is obviously not ideal because the flow is difficult and also introduces some attack surfaces against payers' anonymity and privacy. One more problem is that the invoices are starting to contain too much information, which makes the QR codes becoming difficult to read, especially by smartphone cameras. And as you can see on the right image, the Bolt 12 offers, which we're going to introduce shortly, are much more clear and much easier to read by smartphone cameras. So in order to address these challenges, one of the methods that was introduced is LNURL. What LNURL does is that with LNURL, you have to run an HTTP server alongside your Lightning Network node. And instead of communicating the invoice to the payer, you just show them a QR code that has the encoded URL of your HTTP server. And then when the payer scans the QR code and decodes the URL and gets the URL to your HTTP server, the HTTP server of the payer and the payee can have a two-way communication between each other. And then when they both have enough information, the pay's HTTP server can connect to its own Lightning node, create an invoice, send it to the payer's HTTP server, and then the payer's HTTP server can connect to its own Lightning node to actually pay the invoice. These, as you can see, can facilitate all those use cases that we had, like static invoices, refunds, or subscriptions. But the problem is that because you need to actually run an HTTP server alongside the Lightning node, it adds to the maintenance cost and it also introduces some new attack surfaces against privacy and anonymity of the users. So recently, onion messages were introduced to the Lightning Network. They are basically providing in-network communication between nodes. They can be exchanged among peers, so two nodes don't necessarily have to have a channel between them to be able to pass around these onion messages. And they are also anonymous and privacy preserving because they use onion encryption. And unlike payment onion encrypted messages that could only have a size of 1366 bytes, these onion messages can also have a larger size of 32 kilobytes. And that's because we want them to be able to handle larger payloads and send larger payloads. So the payment procedure with using onion messages and Bolt 12 offers is that the payee only has to communicate an offer to the payer before payment execution on an off network way of communication like QR codes or NFC, which contains much less information than an invoice. So it basically just contains the information for payer to be able to reach the payee with onion messages inside the network. So payer gets that offer and it has enough information to be able to reach the payee with onion messages. So it sends an invoice request to some nodes in the network like D and E, and then it gets a response from the payee, through some network like G and F, for example, an invoice. Then the payer has the invoice and has enough information to be able to execute the payment. So it sends the payment through some nodes like B and C to the pay. Uh, this, as we can see, has a duplex communication between payer and payee before payment execution. So it can facilitate all those use cases that we had again, like subscription, refund, and looks to be working great. It doesn't also need nodes to run an HTTP server next to the Lightning node they have. But the problem is that this 32 kilobytes size, the larger size, can also be used by a malicious adversary to create messages, onion messages that can travel for hundreds of hops in the network. Because the messages are encrypted and the data cannot be seen by the intermediary nodes, a malicious adversary can create onion messages that travel for hundreds of hops. And we don't want that to happen because that would be concerning. We now have messages that are anonymous and privacy preserving and can travel for hundreds of hops in the network. So obviously there is a opportunity for an attacker to execute a DOS attack on the network here, at least on the OM messaging service. Two of the attacks that we introduce is in the first one, the first scenario, the adversary attempts to degrade the availability of the whole onion messaging service by flooding the network. And in the second one, the adversary targets a single honest node and tries to render that node unreachable from the rest of the network. We also propose some assumptions in order to make the analysis simpler in the next steps. So the first assumption is that onion messages can travel between peers. So two nodes do not necessarily need to have a channel between them to be able to pass around these messages. Because of that, because establishing a HTTP connection is not expensive, we assume that there's a complete graph of nodes in the network that can exchange these messages. Also, and we assume that the adversary can create as many nodes as it wants. Obviously, that happens by paying the transaction fee of the funding transactions. And the adversary can decide whether to keep all its funds in one node or divide them on multiple nodes. The third assumption is that the attacker's funds, the amount of funds that the attacker holds, is small compared to the whole amount of funds in the network. And the fourth assumption is that we assume that all nodes in the network will adopt our algorithm. We just do this to make the analysis simpler. So the first component of our algorithm to mitigate these attacks is that we want to limit the travel distance, because for two nodes to be able to reach each other, we definitely don't need hundreds of hops in the network. And in order to provide privacy and anonymity to the users, we also don't need hundreds of hops in the network. We don't propose an exact number, but our guess is that 3 or 4 hops maximum is enough to reach every node in the network. And also it provides enough privacy and anonymity for the users. Because of that, we propose two methods to limit the travel distance. The first one is a hard leash. As its name suggests, it strictly limits the number of hops that a node can travel. And the way that it works is that it splits the message into two parts, a routing info part and the payload part. So the payload part is obviously larger in size, and the routing info part is just for routing information. Both of the parts get encrypted by the source for each hop along the path, and each hop along the path has to decrypt both of these parts separately. This strictly limits the travel distance that any message can travel. Our second method to limit the travel distance is that we introduce a soft leash. One of the pros for this method is that it's flexible. So if a user really wants more privacy, it can create a longer pass, but it comes at a cost. So we leverage proof of work to create that cost. And for the source to create onion messages, the procedure that it goes through is that the source A in this image has to create shared secrets with all the nodes in the path. So the source node A here has to create shared secrets with B, C, and D. Basically, we just get that shared secret, hash it, and then that hash needs to satisfy the proof of work conditions that we put, like being smaller than a certain amount. The upside for this method is that these shared secrets, the creation of these shared secrets by A, if you look at the whole process of how that shared secret is generated, they are chained together. So if A wants to generate a different shared secrets for node C, it also results in a different shared secret for B and D. So because this proof of works get chained together, it gets exponentially more difficult for the source node to add hops to the path. So it cannot create very long paths, and they would be very expensive to create. One more thing is that we want to also stop the adversary from using pre-computed proof of works or executing replay attacks. And because of that, we also include the last Bitcoin block hash in the process. So we basically, instead of just hashing this shared secret, we hash the concatenation of the shared secret and the last Bitcoin block hash. And then that resulting hash needs to satisfy the proof of work conditions. As the second component of our mitigation algorithm, we introduce very simple forwarding rules. The first forwarding rule is that we want the nodes to enforce rate limits on the forwarding requests per neighbor. So we don't want them to enforce any rate limit on the messages that are destined to themselves. So they do not drop messages that are destined to themselves. They just enforce rate limits on the forwarding request per neighbor. The second forwarding rule that we propose is that the rate limits that are assigned to the neighbors are proportional to neighbors' total funds. And by total funds, we mean the sum of the capacity of the channels of that neighbor. And in order to be able to actually enforce that rate limit, the node can use a very simple algorithm like sliding window or token bucketing. As an example, we get an export from the network on February 4th, 2024. At that time, the network had more than 16,000 nodes. And we also assumed to limit the travel distance to 3 hops. 3 hops is not a number that we propose, but because the Tor network uses 3 hops, and 3 hops is enough for every 2 nodes in the network to be able to reach each other, and 3 hops is enough to provide privacy and anonymity to users, we execute this example with 3. These are our simulation results. The column on the left is the amount of funds that the attacker holds. The column on the right is the success rate of 2 honest nodes being able to successfully send each other an anonymous message. So as you can see, before $500, the attacker cannot have an impact on the network because almost all the nodes in the network have more total funds than $500. So the adversary is not able to saturate any channels. But after um, $56,000, you can see a sudden drop in the success rate because most of the nodes have less money than 500K, and that results in the adversary being able to saturate more channels. But again, as you can see, after $500,000, the increase in the success rate is not that significant. Like there are not many nodes that have a total fund between, for example, $500,000 and $1 million. So this suggests that attacker's best strategy might not be to necessarily keep all the funds in one node. That makes sense before a number like $500,000, but after that number, it's probably better for the attacker to create multiple nodes and divide the funds between them. Some points for future work that we propose. The first one is that we also want to know what happens, like does it increase the success rate if we do routing proportional to capacity? Because if we assign the bandwidth proportional to capacity to our neighbors, it's probably better that we also route our messages proportional to capacity. So nodes that have a higher capacity and therefore higher bandwidth, they have a higher chance of being in the path that we choose. The second point for future work that we propose is that we want to analyze the adversary's cost more deeply and know exactly how much money the adversary needs to execute a successful attack on the network. And the third point for future work is that, as we saw on the simulation table, the adversary's best strategy is to keep all its money in one node to some point, but if it has more money than a certain amount, it's probably better for the adversary to divide that money into multiple nodes. So analyzing adversary's best strategy is definitely one point for future work. So in conclusion, our contributions are that we introduced 2 possible DOS attacks on the onion messaging service. Then we went on to propose a mitigation method that was composed of two mechanisms. The first one was limiting the travel distance that these onion messages can travel in the network. And the second one was that we introduced some very simple forwarding rules for nodes to follow. And then at the end, we ran simulations to show how effective our methods are in mitigating these DOS attacks. Thank you.